Hi, welcome back to my channel. I'm Mrs. Aria Lewis, and today I'm going to be sharing my 84-hour labor and birth story. So let's just jump right into it. I woke up on Sunday morning and I was so discouraged with how I hadn't gone into labor yet. I was going to be 42 weeks the next day, and I just did not want to wake up and face the online world because I knew that everyone was going to be like, this is so dangerous, you're going to die, your child's going to die, everyone is going to die, because there's such a stigma about going overdue, right? So I just woke up and I was just like so discouraged. And then a little while later I had 4 very strong contractions. They were like all just a few minutes apart, and I thought to myself, I think this is it. I think I'm going to go into labor today. I think we're gonna have a baby. So my husband came in a little while later and I was just lying in bed and I was like, I think we're gonna have a baby today. So at 8, that was around 7. At 8, I started timing my contractions, and I had this app where my doula and my midwives could watch in real time. And they were every 6 to 10 minutes apart. Kind of lighter intensity, but like still definitely contractions for a couple hours, and then they started getting closer together but the same intensity. So we started setting up our birth space at about 10:30 that morning, and the contractions stalled for about a half hour, but then they picked up an intensity and they started coming like every 2 to 3 minutes. So I was starting to get worried at that point. I'm like texting everybody, I'm like, this is what's going on. And my doula said, okay, maybe I should start making my way towards you. So my doula showed up about 12:30. We filled up the birth pool. I ate lunch. We did some things to get contractions progressing, and they did speed up, but then they slowed down again. Around 5 that day, my midwives came and checked in on me. I had thought about doing a saline lock in my hand for IV fluids because I have POTS, and I was worried that my POTS would flare up during labor with the intense workout that I was having. And so they came and we talked about it, and we decided that since I was doing such a good job staying hydrated and not go ahead and place that lock. I wanted to see how long I could go without it because I didn't really want to have the IV in my hand or my arm. And so we decided to just leave it for now, and once I started feeling like I did not want to drink, then they could place it. Since I've been in labor for about 10 hours already at that point, they advised me to go ahead and eat and then to lay down and rest and really try to get some sleep to store up my energy. I had some sourdough toast and I laid down about 7 that night. So by the time I laid down, I'd been in labor for 12 hours. I was able to sleep in between contractions until about 4 in the morning. Things picked up in intensity like really crazy. So I got up then, but I was so nauseous. I was so extremely nauseous. I could not handle it, so I got back in bed. And thankfully, I was able to actually sleep really well for 2 more hours. And then when I woke up about 6, I didn't feel nauseous and I felt really refreshed. So Monday morning, here we are. It's been 24 hours since I've been in labor at this point. Contractions were definitely intense, but they were far apart. They were like 8 minutes apart, which was so crazy because they'd been much closer apart the day before. So we did a lot of position changes to try to get things to progress, but it really stayed that way for a while. And so my doula, she had stayed the night. She decided to go ahead and leave around 11 that morning to give us some time on our own, and like as soon as she left, things started to pick right up. So about an hour later, things started to feel quite a bit more intense. So we called her back, but then as soon as she showed up, my contractions petered out again. One of my midwives came at 3:30 that afternoon. She brought me some Zofran for in case I got nauseous again in the middle of the night. At this point, I'm thinking I've been in labor for like 30 hours, actually 36, I think. And I was like, I've got to be closer to having this baby. But I was like, in case I go another night and I wake up and I'm super nauseous, like I want to have the Zofran. And she said, you should try to nap again. You know, it's been a while. So everyone left, doula left again, midwife left again, and contractions sped right back up. I think I was having a really hard time getting in the zone when people were here, but then as soon as they left, I was able to focus so much more on just breathing through. Like the mindset worked so much better when people were not around, which makes a lot of sense knowing my brain and how I work, but I didn't really realize that in the moment, and I had a lot of fears as a first-time mom since I'd never gone through labor before. Around this point when my doula left, I started to feel more pressure in my pelvis as well, but in between contractions it felt completely normal, and that was one of the things that my birth team was looking at. They're like, you're able to converse completely normally. You're not really in the zone. I could focus on conversation just fine. They're like, I think you're still in early labor at this point. At 5 that day, so just a couple hours later, my contractions started to run together, and I had texted that to one of my midwives. She advised to get in the pool and see if that helped. She said it was likely that my uterus was holding on to the contractions just because I'd been contracting for so long. So I went ahead and I got in the pool, and it was really nice. We had soft music playing, we had the red light on. Andrew took over communication for me so I could just sit there in the pool, try to be in the zone, just really focus on the contractions and breathing through them. I definitely started to get more in the zone at that point. So my doula came back, but she hung out in the guest room, and then at 10:30, I felt like something changed. I cannot tell you what it was. My water didn't break. I know it wasn't that. But something shifted inside of me, and it might have just been the baby descending, I'm not really sure, but something changed. And so I told Andrew, I'm like, you need to call the midwives because something's different. So they did, and they came and they hung out in my driveway. One of them came in and she listened to Jane's heartbeat, she checked my vitals, saw how I was doing, and then also one of the midwives checked the purple line on my back to see how she thought I was dilated, because I'm super low intervention. So she looked at the purple line and she said she thought I was dilated to about an 8. So I stayed in the pool for quite a while, just Andrew and me, just staying just like super zen, you know, super in the zone. And after a little while, I didn't feel like things were progressing, so I got out and I laid on the couch. I think Andrew probably wanted to see if I could get some rest. And I think I did get a little rest, but then things started to really pick up and intensify. So I'm not sure exactly when. I think it was after midnight, maybe like 1 or 2 in the morning. But things started to intensify so much I could not think about anything else. All I could think about was working through the contractions. I was on hands and knees, like supported by the couch, on the floor. Yeah, the sensations were just all consuming, was all I could think about. I was sure that she was going to come soon, and I think that at this point I did hit transition. But yeah, it was very intense. I think the midwives came back in. I remember Andrew's hands he was doing counter pressure on my hips, and my doula had hot cloths on my belly, which was so nice. My belly and my back, and they were just running around like trying to help. I was just like vocalizing so loudly through this. It was very, very intense. I think it petered out a little bit, and I just remember my hands and knees getting so tired of being in this position for literally hours. Then closer to 6 in the morning, I had several more back-to-back contractions, and things really ramped up again with super strong contractions. I started sobbing and really struggling to take long breaths, and I think that this was probably another transition point. So just a heads up, my midwives think that I hit transition about 3 times during my labor, which is just so wild. Between 6 that morning and 11 a.m., my mind is blank. I don't know what happened. I know I spent a lot of it lying on the couch with the peanut ball, feeling a lot of downward pressure. I know now that she was descending at that point. I didn't know that then because, hello, first-time mom. But yeah, it was just so intense, and I just remember at one point just pleading with God to bring this to an end. I just remember telling him, God, I cannot do this myself. Like, you have got to help me work through this. And I just remember just completely sobbing and just breaking down, just crying so hard. I was just desperate at that point. This was Tuesday morning. I'd been in labor for 48 hours at this point. So at 11:30, I got back in the pool. We had emptied it and refilled it to prevent bacteria growth because it'd been so long. And then around 12, one of my midwives began to get some decelerations on Jane's heart rate. And at this point, I had not eaten since the night before because that night had been so intense, and I was for sure that I was going to have the baby at any moment. The midwives suggested going to town, getting an Airbnb near the hospital in case we needed a transfer so we would be closer. It was starting to snow. They were worried about us getting snowed in and the baby's heart rate descending more and an emergency coming up but not being able to get out. And this was really scary for me. And this really stalled labor because I went into logical thinking mode immediately. And I was like, what can we do to fix this? And so we discussed different options to get labor moving along again since it had stalled out. things we could do to get our heart rate back up. And so I decided to eat and drink because it had been so long since I did that. So I chugged liquids, I ate a really solid snack, and while my labor was still stalled because of the adrenaline, being worried about her heart rate started to improve. I really don't remember what happened the rest of the afternoon, but her heart rates were improving slowly and it was not an emergent situation. But the snow started really coming down fast. Around 3 to 4, my midwife thought we should probably check dilation at this point to see where things are at. The heart rates were just not really where she wanted to see them, even though they weren't super emergent. They weren't perfect. So she was like, you know, we need to see how far along you are. You could be at a 6 and stalled, and with our heart rates like this, you might not, you know, be ready to give birth. We just wanted to know where things were at, even though dilation is not necessarily an indication of when you are going to give birth. It was a helpful tool. So my midwife checked me and she found Jane in the birth canal. 2 knuckles. She was this close from crowning. We had no idea, except for the fact that I had been feeling a lot of downward pressure. But, you know, first time mom, what am I feeling here? I didn't know. So she was super close. And so we were like, okay, well, I can start pushing. And so everyone rushed around, they got the birth kit ready, they got all the supplies out for delivering the baby. We got super excited, like, we're gonna have this baby tonight. And the adrenaline slowed my labor again. But the good news is her heart rates improved really well from there on out, and we did not have any issues with the heart rates from there on. My theory is that after the cervical exam, Jane went back up, so that's fun. So I started pushing without contractions because they'd stalled out, and the midwife started pushing on the top of my fundus to help stimulate contractions. And we tried this for a while. I pushed in all sorts of different positions, but it just wouldn't pick up. You know, I tried all of the ones that people say work really well. I tried on the toilet, hanging from a door, hands and knees. It just wasn't working. So like, okay, you should take a rest. So I tried to take a rest, and then the contractions picked up super hard. So I got up to start pushing, but then they petered out again. We tried a whole bunch of different things. I took some homeopathic remedies to try to keep labor going. I took castor oil. Nothing was happening. I was getting really exhausted, but I couldn't rest because when I rested, I was having really, really strong contractions. So then I wanted to push, but it was just really wild and it just was not going great. So my midwife said, okay, you can't rest. They said, but why don't you try taking a Unisum sleep med, and if you're in active labor, it will not stall anything. But they're like, it could really help you to get some sleep if you can. So I did. And I lied down and I could not sleep. The contractions picked up again. I slept for 5 minutes and I started having really terrible contractions. And I mean, at this point, it's Tuesday night. I've been in labor since Sunday morning, and neither Andrew and I had gotten very much sleep. Poor Andrew was lying next to me and he was sleeping so hard. The man was snoring so loudly and he was just so exhausted because he had been by my side, pretty much hands on me, doing the counter pressure the entire time, because he was the only person who could really do it hard enough and for long enough. And he was just so exhausted. I was having terrible contractions and I started moaning so loudly, just trying to vocalize through the pain, and he snored through all of that. It took me quite a while to wake him up. So I got up because I could not sleep, and we just kept at it. Contraction or no contraction, I just pushed through the night. I pushed all over the house, on the guest bed, on the floor in the living room, on the toilet in the bathroom. We tried different positions and I just kept pushing, and I was purple pushing. And if you're not familiar with birthy things, purple pushing is very exhausting. It's where you take a breath and you bear down and you don't breathe at all. You don't let any air out, you don't make any noise. You just bear down as hard as you can, and then you take a recovery breath, take another breath, and you bear down again. And it is the most exhausting thing I have ever done. I was so tired that I was falling asleep between pushing, like almost blacking out. And I just remember opening my eyes and I was like, I'm still doing this. So finally dawn came and the midwives were like, this has gone on way too long. They would have transferred me much earlier, but we were snowed in under like 6 inches of snow, and underneath the snow was solid ice. So we could not have gotten out any sooner, not even with an ambulance. And that morning, we called an ambulance because we were not sure how it would go driving, especially on the highway if there were accidents. Already, we knew that the highway was completely blocked the way to the hospital that we were planning on going to. So last minute, we decided to go to a completely different hospital that had never been in the plans of going there from the get-go. So I was pushing up until basically the ambulance came. I pushed up until we called the ambulance, just hoping against hope that this baby would show up, that I would be able to have a home birth. Just praying so hard also that God would just work out his will, because I knew, if a hospital birth is what I'm gonna have, then, that's what we're gonna have to do. And I then got my diaper bag, which I packed some stuff to take to the hospital, got some clothes on, I put on Andrew's winter coat and some boots, and the ambulance showed up, and Andrew walked me out to the ambulance, but he could not go with me because of liability issues because of the really bad weather. But thankfully, praise God, one of the midwives was able to come with me, and I'm so thankful because I cannot imagine doing that by myself. So I got on the ambulance and we drove, it was about 40 minutes to the hospital. They didn't have the lights or anything because it was not an emergency. I was just super exhausted and I needed transfer of care to hopefully get an epidural. While I was in the ambulance, I started to feel kind of pushy. For the first time, I had not felt pushy at all before that. And my midwife was timing the contractions that I was having. They were every 5 minutes apart in the ambulance, which is so funny. When you're sitting on like the side, I could not lie down on the bed in the ambulance. I was sitting straight up, right on the edge, because there's no way lying down made my contractions so much worse. And also, since Monday, my uterus was still hanging on to contractions, so it was really hard to tell when one was starting and when one was stopping. Kind of like back labor. If your baby is in the wrong position, sunny side up, and you have a lot of intense back labor, that's sort of what mine was doing. I'm sure it was not as bad as that, but it was still really challenging because there was hardly any break from the contractions. Even though they were 5 minutes apart, I was still in a lot of pain in between. So I wolfed down some trail mix. I had not eaten hardly anything all night except for some spoonfuls of honey. I was staying really hydrated though. So we rode down to the hospital and they wheeled me in, and I was still really I was having these super intense contractions and just in so much pain. So my midwife basically had to speak for me, which is another reason why I'm so glad she came with me. And so they wheeled me in, I talked to the doctor, she was like, I would really advise you have a C-section. I'm like, I really do not want a C-section. If I have to get an epidural, I will get an epidural, but it's I do not want to have a C-section. And I was very thankful because after I said that, she didn't say that again. She didn't suggest having a C-section at any other point from that. A little while later, Andrew and my doula showed up. So thankful that they were able to dig out the truck and drive down without any accidents. One of the midwives is actually car seat installation expert or something. I think there's a different title for that. But she installed the car seat for us. So Andrew and my doula and the car seat, they all made it down and they showed up. And at this point, I was still feeling really pushy. So I literally just started pushing in the hospital room, and I was just really hoping against hope that I deliver this baby, not need to get any meds or anything. The anesthesiologist came in and she gave us the rundown on things, and we went ahead and signed the paperwork, but I didn't decide to get an epidural quite yet. And finally, it had been about 4 hours since I had been at the hospital, and we're like, okay, this is not going anywhere. We do need to get the epidural. So about noon, she came and she put in the epidural. It took a little while for the pain relief to kick in, but when it did, I cannot describe the feeling of having no feeling after 74 hours of unmedicated labor. When your uterus is hanging on to contractions and you're not getting a break in between them. The relief that I had from that was incredible. The doctor checked me and I was only 9 centimeters dilated. I was for sure she was gonna check me and find the baby right there in the birth canal. She did not. The baby went back up. So it's just so wild that happened, but somehow she had gone all the way back up and I'd regressed in dilation. So for the next few hours I rested. I could not sleep. My doula went, she bought me some bone broth to sip on because they didn't want me to eat any solid food in the hospital. And while I would normally ignore that advice because it is kind of outdated, I did realize that 1, there was a pretty high chance that I could need a C-section, and 2, also a high chance that I might throw up because I threw up so much when I was pregnant. So I went ahead and abided by that policy, and I drank a bunch of bone broth, and at this point I had not eaten 16 hours, except for the trail mix on the ambulance. So soon the doctor came in, I think around like maybe 2 or 3 in the afternoon, and she said, okay, so since your water started to break early this morning, she's like, we do need to go ahead and get you starting to push, because the hospital had a policy 12 hours since the water broke. We're kind of getting close to that. So they started getting everything ready. Lots of people came in. They turned up all the lights. It was super bright. Not the environment that I was envisioning giving birth in. But, you know, it was fine. And everyone was super nice. Like, everyone there was just so much fun to work with. And they were having so much fun with each other. I had been lying on one side, and so the epidural started wearing off on one side. So we had to like up the pain medication and wait for that. Around 5 p.m. I started pushing, and the room was just full of women and bright lights, and it was crazy. But it was so nice because Andrew and I had been a team this entire labor, and they let us continue to be a team. They helped us get into different partner-led, partner-assisted positions, which was very challenging since I could not feel anything from the waist down, but I'm so thankful that we could do that. So I started pushing, and I pushed so hard and so fast. I had barely any recovery time in between the pushes. I was just giving it my all, and we were trying to get that baby out as fast as possible. After a couple hours, I started to have some really bad acid reflux, which was really weird, random, and annoying. So we got some Pepsid thrown in the IV. At this point, I was just like, give me all the drugs. We need to get this baby out. Finally, after about 3-ish hours, it felt like we were making progress. It took so long. And then after 3.5 hours, I pushed down her head, and then her shoulders and her body. It was the weirdest feeling, and she was born. I can't imagine what it would feel like to not have any pain meds. Honestly, I'm a little scared to think about what it would feel like without pain meds, but it was really cool to like feel her coming out of my body but not feel pain. I did feel some pressure, and I only started to feel pushy in like the last hour that I was pushing. It was so wild. But yeah, she was born, and they put her on my chest, and they started to stitch me up, which was quite the process. For some reason, they didn't have like a big light in the room, so my husband stood there and he held his flashlight for the doctor to stitch me up. Like what? Until they brought in a big light for her. I had a really gnarly tail tear. It was a bit rough. So I'm thankful I had the epidural, because that tear would not have been fun without that. But she was here, we started breastfeeding, and it was all right in the world. She finally showed up after 84 hours of labor. So crazy. Immediately postpartum, I think everyone left finally around like 2 a.m. Got a little bit of sleep that night. The next morning I could barely walk. I was so done in. After that experience of just being so active through my entire labor and then going to hospital and getting the epidural, like I think the epidural usually, from what I've heard, can make it really rough to move around the next day, but then also since I had used literally every muscle that exists in my body, I was just so dead the next day, and poor Andrew was so dead the next day. We had been through so much together in that labor. But Jane was fine, and she was perfect, and she didn't have any heart rate problems. She has no problems. The baby is perfect, and I just thank God so much that even though I had so many issues in my pregnancy, mostly just with throwing up all of the time, and my labor was so slow and weird and pushing like did not work, that Jane was fine. Yeah, I'm just so thankful. And so yeah, that is my super crazy birth story. I left the hospital 2 days after I gave birth, and they wheeled me out in a wheelchair because I was still really weak from that experience. And we got home, and my parents showed up a little while later, which was really good because our house was a mess after birth. The birth team had definitely tried to clean up whatever they could, but they had been at our house for 36 hours, and they needed to go home and sleep because they also had other people who were due pretty soon after me. So it was crazy, but I had the most wonderful team. My birth team at home, the midwives and my doula were incredible. Andrew was the most supportive partner I could have ever asked for. You know, you hear stories about dads who are complaining and stuff. Not a word. He was there for me the entire time, and I cannot imagine going through labor and delivery without his literally unfailing support. I mean, he's the only reason why I ever considered doing this again, is because of the support that he gave me. So I'm just really, really thankful for that, because that was what I needed to get me through. And I really think that the reason I was able to get through 84 hours of labor was because of my husband's unwavering support. Anyway, so that is the story in its entirety, and I hope you enjoyed. You have negative things to say. If you think that what we did was not right or should have gone differently, you don't know my situation. You do not know my body. You were not there in the room, so you cannot speak on that. So I just ask that you refrain from judging my experience, and if you don't, then you will probably be dealt with and blocked. Otherwise, I appreciate all positive comments and also questions. I'm happy to answer some questions too. If any of this was unclear or you want to know further information, maybe I'll do a Q&A in another video. But yeah, thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed after all of the lead up. It's a crazy birth story. But yeah, if you want to see more content from me, highly recommend liking and subscribing to my channel, and I will catch you guys next time.